Our story begins moments after the rebels, Kalani, and his forces fled Agamar. Kalani thought it would be best to go their separate ways, as he didn't think the rebels had a chance. Rex and the rebels thought this was a big shame, as his brilliant tactical mind was what they needed to assist in taking out the Empire. So Rex stepped up, and just before communications ended, Rex calmly reminded Kalani by stating that during the CIS occupation, the rebels shouldn't have won that battle, but they did. They prevailed, and that's how Kalani ended up here at Agamar. He also explained that his point was that the rebels have a chance to beat the Empire, but with Kalani, they would be able to fare so much better. He also asked Kalani, why waste such talents? And what else was he going to do? He also asked Kalani, why waste such talents? And what else was he going to do? Rex did this because they all had just won the Clone Wars. Why not make it last and be remembered for the rest of the galaxy as heroes? Imagine that, the Republic and the CIS with the Rebel Alliance working together but winning this time. As it was once said, who cares who started the war? It takes two to fight it. So why not make it three? Kalani thought about this. While he may not be able to get his droid army back, he could realistically assist the rebels in destroying the Empire, and as much as he hated to admit it, Rex had a very good point. He was intelligent, but even the most intelligent people or droids can be outsmarted. That's what he learned from his limited time in the Clone Wars and the two battles he had during Agamar. He became very curious to see what it would be like to win with very small odds. Not to mention, he could be remembered for his intelligence being used for freedom from the tyranny of the Empire, just as he intended to during his time in the CIS. Plus, Rex was convincing, so he agreed to join Phoenix Squadron, which would soon become a member of the Rebel Alliance, among many other cells of the Rebel Alliance. Kalani would meet up with Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, Leia Organa, General Dodonna, Jude Sutor, and various other members of the secret Rebel Council. He would learn of their plan to unite the Rebel cells into one single cell, which was an idea that Kalani liked. He also suggested that they make 3 massive fleets/armies. These specific armies would attack key Imperial infrastructure such as shipyards and factories, hoping that they would be able to cut off Imperial production while building up their army. This would be extremely risky, but if the rebels could pull this off, then they could reach victory a lot sooner. While the rebels had gained a couple of MC-80 star cruisers from Admirals Akbar and Radis, they needed more as it would strengthen the rebels and turn them into an actual military fighting force. Kalani suggested they make an alliance with the Mon Calamarans and Quarrens, as they are both capable of creating incredible ships. He also asked for acclimators and venators because they were very effective ships, which he found out the hard way during the first battle of Agamar during the Clone Wars. He also suggested they go out and find CIS ships that might still be around. The rest of the council agreed to this notion, and Leia would personally go out and make the alliance happen. Bail discussed the Venator and Acclimator ship idea with Kalani. Bail explained that there were Venators and Lucrehulks being dismantled at Braca, so perhaps they could get the designs from there. Or alternatively, they had someone on the inside of the Kuat drive yards who gave them the RZ-1 A-Wing designs to continue to build their military. However, Bail stated that the Kuat drive yards only made Venators, but not Acclimators, so they could get Venator designs from the Kuat drive yards. Kalani said that would do, but wondered if the rebels by chance had any Acclimators. Bail would ask Dodonna, who was with him at the time, before being sent off on a mission, and Dodonna said that one of the cells had an Acclimator. So Kalani said they would get the design schematics for the Acclimator and design more of them, as well as designing the Venators. Bail said that their alliance with the Mon Calamarans and Quarrens meant that they could access the orbital shipyard above the planet Dak. The rebels would offer to assist in taking back Mon Cala, which Admiratus and Akbar agreed to this notion. So they set out to convince the Mon Calamari and Quarrens to rise up against the Empire, who were only subjugating them to slavery. They would also present proof to convince the Mon Calamarans and the Quarrens that they were being enslaved. The rebels were aided by Prince Lichar, who was liberated by the rebels secretly. The Ghost Crew and Leia would successfully meet Prince Lichar, and luckily Ezra and Kanan could sense that Moff Tarn Hubie had a button to activate a silent alarm, pulled it away from Hubie with the Force, and would crush it with the Force. He and Ezra would use a little bit of Force heal together to keep Lichar alive, just a little bit more, and they would take Hubby away with Lichar and successfully extract Lichar out of the prison thanks to a bit of distracting handiwork from Chopper. Lichar would be placed aboard one of the Nebulon B frigates, and they would jump to hyperspace away from the planet that Lichar was imprisoned in, and Lichar would be fully healed within 2 weeks thanks to the handiwork of the medical droids and the Force heal from Kanan and Ezra. The rebels would assist Lichar and the Mon Calamaran mercantile fleet in taking back Mon Cala as well as Dak, which, thanks to the rebels and Mon Calamarans all banding together to force the Empire to retreat from those 2 planets. The rebels and mercantile fleet would protect the shipyard at Dak and Mon Calamara and Mon Cala, allowing production on more rebel ships to begin. They would start building A-Wings, Y-Wings, and B-Wings, as well as various naval ships, as a start towards building the 3 armies and expanding their capabilities with hit-and-run tactics. Some of these ships would include Lucrahogs and Venators, since the rebels successfully managed to get those designs off Bracca. The Mon Calamarans would also set up another shipyard on their moon of Crinamonan 3. Over the next few months, they would create 1 out of 3 of their big fleets. They had considered taking back Lothal during this construction period, but after learning about Thrawn's search for their base on Atollon, they needed to evacuate the planet and find more bases. Would it work, as Thrawn would find out about this and would wipe them out in an instant. They had been setting up a base on Yavin 4, so they decided to meet there. He stated that they would need to still liberate Lothal, but they needed to wait just a little more as they were still building 3 armies. Atollon was no longer a viable planet to stay at until they defeated Thrawn. He was just too much of a threat right now, and if they lost their fleet, then they would have no choice but to go into hiding for a while, as well as commit to small-scale hit-and-run tactics here and there again. Ezra was disappointed and heartbroken about this, but he understood Kalani's stance on their original plan. This would be a perfect test to see how one of their armies would fare against the Empire. Also, Kalani decided to let Thrawn come to Atollon, and perhaps then they could set up a trap to strike him at Atollon, and then the rebels could strike Lothal. The problem was that the fleet the rebels had prepared to take Lothal just seemed a bit too small, as they only had 19 naval ships, none of them being actual warships. So to fix this issue, the Mon Calamaran mercantile fleet would join them just to make sure that they could take Lothal and hopefully lure Thrawn into either Atollon or Lothal to eliminate him, as he was too dangerous to be left alive at this point. The point of the mercantile fleet is to give the rebel fleet some warships for the backbone of the rebels' fleet. After a re-evaluation of the fleet, Kalani still didn't think it would be enough, as A-Wings, while very impressive, they still weren't blockade runners, and they only had 1 B-Wing available, and while it could definitely do a lot for the rebels, they'd still lose it in an instant. They only had 1 big fleet besides this other fleet they've created, the smaller one, but they needed to use it for something else, potentially an attack on Lothal. So the rebels needed to call upon their small allies during the last few months it took for Thrawn to find Atollon. They looked through their options of potential alliances. Some included the group of Wookiees they rescued from Kessel and the Mandalorians. The Mandalorians were still trying to take back Mandalore, so the rebels decided to assist the Mandalorians, not just for alliance of course, and the rebels also contacted the Wookiee resistance hoping they would join them, but they were already struggling to liberate Kashyyyk with only 3,000 Wookiees and no vehicles, so the Rebel Alliance agreed to send a fleet to aid them. The rebels also promised that they would liberate the Wookiees that were sent to Kessel and hopefully be able to find the rest of the Wookiees by capturing the Imperial intel that might hopefully be on Kashyyyk. The rebel spies reported that the fleets above Kessel, Kashyyyk and Mandalore weren't too big, so the rebels would split their forces and go to attack attack those 3 planets and liberate them with ease after waiting for a few months. Now, the fleet they were using was actually one of their big 3 fleets that they had finished creating recently. The rebels would sustain significant losses on Kashyyyk, but they would end up winning, and they would temporarily shut down the mines on Kessel and free all the slaves as a way to stick it to the Pike Syndicate. Now, just another thing to note, the reason why the rebels had significant losses on Kashyyyk was not because of the navy, but was because the army was big. That was the one thing the rebels hadn't realized. Kalani stated that they needed starfighters, which Mothma explained that she had been in contact with Incom Corporation, and they said that they had produced 1 million X-Wing starfighters for the Empire, but the Empire decided not to buy them. This would be so expensive for the rebels, but the rebels needed to do something, and these fighters would be the right fighters for them. So the rebels bought them all. It helped that Bail and Mothma were super wealthy, and their royal wealth would be crucial in assisting the Rebel Alliance. The reason why Kalani wanted actual starfighters rather than A-Wings, which were more suitable for the role of an interceptor, was because he was up against a highly intelligent individual. But what Kalani came to learn was that even the most intelligent individuals can make big mistakes too, which was noticeable by the fact that Thrawn didn't even kill Ezra, believing it was all for a big grand plan, which Thrawn was only half right about. Kelly Paris, the CEO of Incom, would oversee the production of X-Wings for the Rebel Alliance in their little underground network. Kalani would use 1,070 of the X-Wings for the defense of Adelon to fill the MC-80 Starcruisers, and then 900 X-Wings to help wipe out the enemy with one easy strike. The rest would go out to operate with hit-and-run tactics. The Rebels would have nearly 2,000 X-Wings above the planet of Adelon with the defense fleet. Kalani just knew he could win, as he felt that he understood Thrawn based on the things he had heard about him from Ezra, Kanan, Kallus, who Kalani told Ezra and Kanan to bring back to the Alliance, as he knew Thrawn would only just be playing games with Kallus at this point. Kalani had come a long way within these few months. This battle would be challenging, but with Kalani, it would no longer be a trap, but would be a battle of wits between 2 of the greatest minds in the galaxy. Part of that being because Thrawn had been getting a little cocky lately due to his belief in his grand plan. Thrawn's 7th fleet arrived, but he would be met with a challenge. Thrawn was up against a fleet of 38 rebel naval ships, over 2,000 starfighters, 132 interceptors, and 24 bombers commanded by General Kalani, which Thrawn didn't know about. He would deploy his ground forces while the TIE fighters, interceptors, and bombers distracted the rebel fleet. Not to mention, the rebel fleet couldn't escape, but when these strange X-Wing starfighters were deployed against Thrawn's fleet, the battle truly begun, and many starfighters started falling on Kalani's side. But then, Thrawn started losing starfighters on his side. It went back and forth, but the X-Wings made significant progress against the starfighters, and Thrawn could not believe this. He started to actually become outsmarted. How could that be possible? He's Grand Admiral Thrawn! What really embarrassed him more was the fact that the ground battle was actually going terribly as his forces were being wiped out by the rebels. Mainly because the walkers had to fight against 150 X-Wings stationed on the planet. But then the stormtroopers would start to fall 7 hours later, as the rebels had nearly half of the amount of stormtroopers. Plus, the rebels had hope, heart, and grit, which was something the stormtroopers would lose as the hours went by. However, the rebels lost nearly 20,000 soldiers, and they were only 25,000 strong to begin with. But they would find success regardless. Part of the rebel success was thanks to the leadership and strategy of Commander Rex, Kallus, and Zeb. This battle had seen nearly 100,000 losses just with the Air Force and ground forces. There were more Imperial losses than Rebel losses, which was good. It was truly thanks to the X-Wings' consistent efficiency in both ground and air assaults, as the entire Imperial Air Force would be wiped out, to which that now meant the X-Wings and the other starfighters had the ability to take on the Navy, which was just making Thrawn's tactics even more challenging, and once his support ships got wiped out, out, thanks to the swarm of X-Wings, A-Wings, and Y-Wings, Thrawn understood that if his Star Destroyers could not destroy the rebels, then he would have no choice but to retreat. He finally realized that the rebels were prepared for him this whole time, and someone had been awaiting him, someone brilliant who was on the rebel side. He knew someone was leading this fleet, but he couldn't figure out who. The Imperial Star Destroyers, basically left defenseless, would be destroyed, but the Chimera was able to escape. However, the Dark Omen wouldn't be so lucky. The rebels had just destroyed a massive third of the 7th Star Fleet, and they didn't fully know that, as the Star Destroyers were the most important part of his fleet. But Kalani surprisingly had this strange feeling, which Jun Sato explained that it was pride. He felt proud for defeating Thrawn in battle, and the rebellion was extremely proud of him too. So Thrawn would retreat to his 7th Star Fleet, or what remained of it, really. The rebels prepared to evacuate Atollon, as a bigger Imperial fleet would most likely attack them for sure. But before they left, Kanan would talk to Bendu, who was furious with Kanan before the battle, believing that Kanan brought war to his home. But Kanan explained to Bendu that they had a general who would help them win the battle, which did happen. Kanan wouldn't let Atollon fall to the Empire. Kanan promised that the rebels would leave Bendu's home once they won the battle, and they would take their stuff with them. But before Kanan left, he laid down a communication device stating that if the Empire dared do anything to this planet, a rebel fleet would assist them immediately. Bendu was skeptical, but he could sense Kanan's sincerity. So he accepted his promise, but mentioned that if Kanan didn't keep his promise, then the rebels would not be allowed to return to Atollon. Kanan accepted this, and made his way to prepare for the Battle of Atollon. Once the battle was finished, the rebels packed up and left with Kanan and Ezra saying goodbye to Bendu. Bendu said that if they need more training and balance, they would come back to Atollon, preferably without the Empire, Bendu said in a joking way. Kanan sighed, and Ezra and Bendu chuckled a little, and then they said farewell to each other, and the rebels left Atollon for now. The rebels would use their Atollon fleet to attack Lothal as originally intended, but with the addition of X-Wings and the B-Wing prototype, just to help them win. While that would happen, the rebels would also use 4 U-Wing gunships they bought from Incom. The other 2 big fleets would defend Yavin 4, Dantooine, and Mandalore. They would also eventually rescue Sullust. In the meantime, the smaller shipyards would construct ships to assist the rebels in their hit-and-run tactics to make the Empire think that they were just a small army still, and that their Atollon fleet was their biggest fleet. And their other goal was to still make the galaxy see them as the little guy being capable of winning against a massive empire, rather than another big military that was just like the Empire. Back to the attack on Lothal, the rebel fleet jumped out of hyperspace to destroy what remained of the 7th Star Fleet, which was still stationed above Lothal, as Thrawn decided to commit his entire fleet to protect Lothal and his TIE Defender project. The rebels knew that Thrawn would be prepared this time, but they didn't know what Thrawn was up to. But what the rebels didn't know was that Thrawn only had 1 Star Destroyer protected by some space factories and smaller support ships. So General Kalani would lead the fleet again, as he knew Thrawn's fleet was there on Lothal, and the rebels just didn't want to take any chances. The space battle began with a swarm of X-Wings and A-Wings deployed, destroying and cutting down many TIE fighters. 1 TIE Defender was also deployed to assist the air battle. While the air battle was occurring, the 4 U-Wing gunships were deployed onto the ground, carrying Special Forces troopers and an extra pilot led by Callus, as they believed that there may be more TIE Defenders stationed on the planet, and they wanted to steal one so they could cut down the rest of them. The Imperial fleet was hitting hard against the rebel starfighters, with many starfighters, interceptors, and bombers falling to the Empire. But the Imperial Navy would be overwhelmed and would be wiped out after 4 hours of fighting. Thrawn had successfully made his way down to the planet on one of his shuttles to retreat into the government building. The rebels then began their ground assault and would use guerrilla warfare to their advantage, but they were still outnumbered by the stormtroopers. But luckily for the rebels, a third of the stormtroopers were stationed in the government building to protect Thrawn. An additional number of rebel troopers to their forces, but the rebels would still lose many of their forces due to the Empire still overwhelming them. Back in the space battle, Commander Volt Scarus was in pursuit against Hera, who was flying the B-Wing prototype. Scarus's TIE Defender would be destroyed thanks to Hera's B-Wing using using all 4 of her lasers, and thanks to a good chunk of the Navy using their full concentrated firepower against the TIE Defender. Luckily, Hera was a skilled pilot, otherwise she might have also been destroyed in the crossfire. And just to clarify, the B-Wing was still heavily damaged by the TIE Defender, so it would have to return to the Quasar-class carrier. Hera would be picked up by the Ghost, however, and she would land to assist in the ground charge that was being led by Rex, who was retreating further into the city with the remaining rebel troopers due to their low numbers. But when all seemed lost for the rebel troopers, starfighters came down to the planet to assist in destroying the factories and vehicle reinforcements. But that wasn't all. Their allies, Bo-Katan and Chief Tarful, came to assist with Mandalorian and Wookiee armies in both the air and ground assaults. The Air Force was also assisted by a Wookiee gunship piloted from everyone's favorite Wookiee from Season 1. The battle reopened with the remaining stormtroopers falling to the Wookiees, Mandalorians, and rebels. Inside the government building, Thrawn received contact from his mysterious archenemy, and he could not believe it. A CIS tactical droid. A CIS tactical droid was able to challenge him and defeat him? He kind of respected it, to be honest, but it was still back to the present. Kalani stated that Thrawn had fought valiantly, but it was over. The rebels were in the building and would arrest him as long as he and his remaining forces surrendered. But Thrawn just asked him, "Are you quite finished?" Thrawn stated that if he and his rebel forces didn't surrender, he would self-destruct the government building, killing everyone in the city where the large majority of the population were. Rook, who was with Thrawn, and Governor Price looked at him in shock. More Price than Rook, but it was a little noticeable on Rook's face. Kalani wasn't concerned, as he was programmed to win battles at all costs, but he did become a little bit more caring over the course of the 2 years he spent with the rebels. Also, other rebel leaders said no to Kalani allowing Thrawn to blow up the building. So Kalani just said to Thrawn that he actually enjoyed a challenge like Thrawn, but unfortunately their game was at an end. Thrawn was confused, but then he saw a TIE Defender outside of the window of the government building, and the last thing he saw was it firing missiles, killing everyone, killing Thrawn, his Death Troopers, Governor Price, and Rook immediately, preventing the self-destruct sequence from happening. Now you're probably wondering, where did this TIE Defender come from? Well, the Special Forces team had actually managed to find Thrawn's new TIE Defender and hijack it, and for the whole battle, it was over. The rebels won the battle. Factories were destroyed, and Thrawn was defeated. And the sad truth for Thrawn was that he only realized he wasn't able to accept that his grand plan had failed, and that even the smartest people can make mistakes until it was too late. Now, for the people of Lothal, they celebrated for days and welcomed the Rebel Alliance, and would actually become a crucial ally of the Rebel Alliance. Farmers would grow crops for them so they could keep food supplies going. And for the rebels, they would stay for a week to start rebuilding and celebrate with the people, but then they would have to officially disappear before the Empire found them, assuming the Empire was going to be taking the planet back. Ezra and the Ghost Crew would stay for a little bit longer, which Kalani and the Alliance Council accepted, as this was their home. And they would secretly have one of their fleets ready to defend Lothal if the Empire ever came back. During the next couple of months, the rebels just committed to hit-and-run tactics with their hand-me-down ships and starfighters, interceptors, and bombers. A couple of months later, the rebels were contacted by Saw Gerrera via hologram, who did nothing but call the rebels weak, not knowing that they had been making a significant difference in the galaxy by arresting Imperial forces that surrendered and helping civilians rather than just targeting them. They also even rescued slaves and were taking the Empire slowly but surely each day. Gerrera did not like that one, as all this is what Mon Mothma was telling him. Their call would end before a war could start between the rebels and the partisans. A couple of days later, the rebels would hear about a weapon that Cassian Andor had recently discovered. Ezra and Sabine had also mentioned that they had recently encountered Saw Gerrera, who had also believed that there was a weapon stationed at Jeddah. Kalani was curious about all this information, while the rest of the council was still a little bit skeptical. Kalani thought it couldn't hurt to investigate, so he suggested they send one of the 3 newly built armies to capture this weapon if it existed, as he believed if it did existed, needed, then the rebels needed to act quickly. So the rebels would send Andor, K2SO, and their newly acquired asset Jin Erso to find Guerrera on Jeddah, as they knew he was there, even though he denied that he wasn't. While Andor and his team went down to the planet of Jeddah, the big rebel fleet would find this weapon at Jeddah and destroy it. And with that, both teams jumped to hyperspace. The rebels arrived at Jeddah and sent squadrons of X-Wings, A-Wings, B-Wings, Y-Wings, and U-Wings down to the planet, while the rest of the fleet went to find this Imperial weapon. The fleet successfully found the weapon, as it turned out to be a space station. Judging by the look of the space station, it looked like it could house. So instead of destroying it, the rebels changed their plan and decided to take it. So an air battle started to ensue, with tens of thousands of starfighters on both sides launching from either the Death Star or rebel ships. Krennic and Tarkin, who were aboard the Death Star, were so confused as to how the rebels could have figured out about the Death Star and how they had such a massive fleet. This had Krennic worried that the rebels knew about Eadu too, or even worse, Scarif, which wasn't the case yet for either Scarif or Eadu. But back to the battle, it was brutal. Thousands upon thousands of starfighters on both sides were falling. Back at the space battle of Jeddah, the Imperial Air Force had now been destroyed after constant hours of fighting. The issue was that a fleet led by Darth Vader came to investigate the skirmish on Jeddah, so a medium portion of the rebel starfighters were redirected to fight off Vader's fleet, while the rest of the fleet took out the Death Star's defenses. Vader's fleet would be destroyed within 2 hours, and Vader would not be able to escape due to the fleet being too massive even for him. The next step was to land the troops in the Death Star, which would go somewhat seamless. Hundreds of thousands of rebel troopers were dropped off in the Death Star's various hangars. It was made easy because by now most of the turrets and ion cannons had been destroyed. Captain Rex, Hera, Zeb, and Callus were leading the charge just like they did on Atollon. The rebels were outnumbered, but they would be reinforced by remaining troopers aboard their naval ships, as the U-wing gunships would constantly be dropping in new soldiers to reinforce their soldiers. After all, they had brought a massive army using many of their troopers that joined the Rebel Alliance. The only problem was the more armies they made, the less troopers they would have available, committing all their troopers to these big armies. But back on the Death Star, many of the stormtroopers were in the hangars and shuttle bay, but they were wiped out by the rebels by the end of the day, after a large, consistent, grueling battle that took place between the two factions. But the Empire just could not hold back the rebels, as the rebels had fire and grit in them, while the Imperials were starting to lose that. While many of the Imperials had loyalty, they were starting to question their loyalty to the Empire. Another problem was the weapon wasn't fully charged yet, so the rebels still had some time, as the Empire was still using the weapon because that's all they could do now, as the rebels couldn't technically destroy that weapon, unless they destroyed the Kyber crystal. Now, the rebels that were aboard the Death Star were still outnumbered by many officers, maintenance crew, gunners, and remaining stormtroopers, which is exactly why the rebels brought in more troopers into the station. Once they had enough troopers, they would start splitting up the crew to arrest them and make them think they were outnumbered. Many of them would fight back but would be gunned down. Now, during the night time at Jeddah, the rebels had successfully captured the Kyber crystal area, and they stopped the weapon from firing. And they also managed to capture the main brig surrounding Krennic and Tarkin, who would be killed too because they were too dangerous to be kept alive, and they did try to fight back. Also, some rebels couldn't hold themselves back, but they would be forgiven, as one of the rebel troopers that killed Tarkin were related to one of the protesters that was squashed by Tarkin's shuttle during a protest. Millions of troopers on both sides had fallen within this battle, and that was just on the Death Star, on both the ground and space above the planet. It was a truly terrifying battle, but the rebels had won, and now they had a space station that could support their efforts in taking out the Empire. The rebels decided they would place every prisoner they had aboard the prison cells that were aboard the space station, and they would immediately have the space station defended while they brought countless technicians to fix the hyperdrive. After about a day, they would jump to hyperspace and go to somewhere, perhaps in wild space or even Yavin 4. Now, some Some Imperial fleets did try to take back the weapon, but they were all cut down by the rebel fleet, which meant the rebels lost more ships. They did lose some naval ships, but they did manage to win every time the Imperials tried to take back the Death Star. After the rebels took the Death Star with them, they would then begin fixing the turrets and ion cannons. Then begin fixing the ion cannons and the turrets too, as well as dismantling the laser cannon for the Kyber crystal. After the attack on Jeddah, the rebels would find out from Galen Erso's hologram that he was located on Eadu, where the rebels would go to rescue Galen from the lab facility on the planet along with the rest of the scientists. Jin was extremely grateful for the rescue and would reunite with her father. Jin, Galen, and the scientists would join the Rebel Alliance, and Galen informed the Rebel Council that the Death Star plans were hidden in a secret citadel on Scarif. The rebels would take the citadel base with ease thanks to another massive rebel fleet. Thanks to using another massive rebel fleet. The Imperial defense was quite strong as the Imperials had a lot of projects there they needed to protect, but once again the rebels were able to defeat their naval force. The Empire already had a lot of territory to defend, so they didn't have much available at the time, and they didn't have dreadnoughts yet. Once the rebels took over the citadel, they would download every single Imperial project into their databanks, and after they got all the information they needed, they would destroy the citadel. The rebels would end up hiding the Death Star over at Yavin 4, which was protected by one of the 6 fleets. After that, the rebels would mainly commit to hit and run tactics against the Empire, which was made a lot easier because they could just track the Empire through hyperspace from one of the projects they stole from Scarif. This event occurred while the rebels were finishing construction on another 3 fleets. Otherwise, they set up rebel bases on Crate, Aegon Class, Hoth, Dantooine, Dakar, and besides those planets, the rebels also set up bases on 4 other planets in the galaxy. The Empire knew the rebels would have had to have been massive to take the Death Star, or to even make it disappear, and even just to be able to destroy multiple Imperial fleets, but they couldn't pinpoint where this attack was as the rebels were just committing to hit and run tactics. But they were increasing too, which was even bigger problem, which was an even bigger thorn in the Empire's side. Not to mention, Palpatine lost his apprentice and many of his top Imperial leaders. People who weren't a part of the Rebel Alliance were also starting to rebel against the Empire. Thanks to the rebels staying back for a little while, they would liberate Ryloth to add another member to their alliance. It also gave the rebels an opening to the Corellia Run, which allowed the rebels to send an army through the run to take Coruscant and cut off the head of the snake. Part of this thanks to Corellia allowing them to come through their territory. Squads such as Rogue One, Spectre Cell, and Rogue Squadron managed to sneak into Coruscant to disable the planetary shields. This would prove difficult, but they managed to do it regardless. They were also accompanied by Special Forces units, led by Commander Gregor. And once one of the shields were disabled, the rebel army, led by General Kalani and Captain Rex, jumped to hyperspace, as they would at least try to kill Palpatine, and they were joined with Ahsoka, who had been brought back from the world between worlds thanks to Ezra. Ezra and Ahsoka had brought some extra helpers, which consisted of Ben Kenobi, Kel Kestis, Rom Koda, and Yoda, who would also assist in guiding the Jedi in this battle to defeat Palpatine. Palpatine had one of his large attack fleets stationed above Coruscant to defend it. So this would be a great challenge, but if the rebels could take Coruscant, then they could win once and for all. Palpatine was prepared for this attack, however, so he had launched his fighters before the rebels arrived. But the rebels were able to launch their starfighters in time, led by Hera Syndulla, who wasn't with Spectre Cell during the disabling of the planetary shields. And once both starfighters were in range, a fiery battle began between both sides. The battle would go on for hours, with each side constantly shooting each other down. The Empire took losses, the rebels took losses, everyone was just taking losses, and it was all starting to mount up. But this was the final fight, and Palpatine was already trapped on the planet. And he knew that, but he had one last resort that would turn this battle around. He just needed the rebels to land on the surface, which they would after fighting off the Navy and giving the gunships an opening to land on the planet. And the rebels would eventually win the naval battle thanks to General Kalani's brilliant tactics, along with the help of General Dodana and Jun Sato. The ground battle was the most grueling of them all because the Empire had fortified the city to prepare for this attack. But luckily for the rebels, they had more time because rebellions had been springing up across the galaxy, as well as on Coruscant. And the rebels had actually managed to take many shipyards, including the Kuat drive yards, as Palpatine was distracted on Coruscant. So the rebels took advantage of it and had begun their attacks. And to take the shipyard on Coruscant, the rebels sent 10,000 troopers to take the shipyard on the planet, so they could cut off any chance of reinforcements for the Empire. And they would manage to take the shipyard because there weren't many Imperials holding the shipyard because they were spread too far across the planet, thanks to some rebellions rising above from the Coruscant underground, and just from the rebels in general. Now for the big ground invasion, it would prove difficult, as many starfighters were fighting against countless walkers, but the rebels needed to clear a way for the rest of the Alliance to take out Palpatine. But he wouldn't get a chance to continue this, as the Jedi came to intercept him, and a new fight would ensue between the Jedi and Palpatine. And Palpatine would attempt to escape, but as he ran outside of the building, an X-Wing had been shot by a walker and was crashing down Palpatine's way. But Yoda was able to save the pilot by using the Force, and Palpatine would try to take advantage, but Yoda, Cal, and the rest of the Jedi would stop him together by combining their Force powers. And once the pilot escaped, they released the ship onto Palpatine, but this would not kill Palpatine. So Cal thought quickly and threw his lightsaber at Palpatine because he didn't get a chance to stop Cal, as Palpatine had been electrocuted by Yoda, as Palpatine was trying to electrocute Yoda to stop him from saving the pilot. And with that, the lightsaber cut Palpatine, and the X-Wing fell on top of him. Palpatine would try to make the Jedi pay for this by attempting to essence transfer into his Sith body on Exegol, but unfortunately the body was not ready for transfer, so he would end up killing the body as well as himself during this transfer. The ground invasion went extremely well once the walkers were destroyed, as more people from the lower levels were assisting the rebel ground troops who were led by Rex, Wolf, and Callus in taking out the stormtroopers, and they would have enough troopers to do so. And with that, the rebellion worked, and in 2 days of fighting, the Empire would officially surrender. And with that, the rebels and the people of Coruscant would cry out a huge cheer. The Empire would keep fighting, and Operation Cinder would occur, but the rebels would stop the Empire at Vardos. The Empire's horrific project would ultimately convince the people to side with the rebels, which gave the rebels more personnel to work with, as many actually started joining the Rebel Alliance military. The rebels also had 2 new deserters join by the name of Del Meeko and Iden Versio, as they saw that the Empire did not care for those loyal to them. Others in the Empire would desert and join the winning side, and with that, the final confrontation would be at the Battle of Jakku, which the rebels won. The remainder of the Empire fled to the unknown regions, but they had significantly less than what they would have had Kalani not taken them out. They also didn't have any shipyards left, so they couldn't really do much. They were able to take one, but the rebels took it back pretty quickly, since they had massive fleets now. It was a complete disaster for the Empire, and would be even more of a disaster when the rebels tracked the Imperial forces to the unknown regions through the Empire's secret hyperspace lane. The rebel fleet, which was actually led by the Adelon fleet, that had combined itself with one of the big fleets, would capture the shipyards, other various facilities in the unknown regions, and would entirely wipe out the rest of the Empire. They would also wipe out the Sith Eternal and General Enric Pride at the Battle of Exegol, which wasn't even a battle. Bail Organa would officially become the Chancellor of what became the New Republic, with Mothma next in line once Bail's term was over. But in the meantime, they would expand into the unknown regions thanks to the facilities they had captured in the area, and the New Republic would continue to support planetary defense forces and provide medical aid to the civilians of the galaxy. They also wiped out all the crime syndicates like the Hutts, Black Sun, Pike Syndicate, and the rest of them. As for the Death Star, the rebels would keep using it as a space station. They would also use Starkiller Base as one of their next bases, as the planet was too far destroyed by the Empire. But the base would be quite effective for the Republic's operations in the unknown regions. As for the Death Star, they would station it in the Outer Rim to make sure no criminal factions could ever rise again. However, it would be held in Yavin 4 just so it could stay protected. For the Jedi, they would train Luke and rebuild the Jedi Order. On another note, Kalani, Rex, the Jedi, and the rest of the rebellion would be hailed as heroes. There would still be small pockets of corruption in the Senate, and sometimes occasional rebellions and resistance movements from Imperial loyalists, but they were just tiny little resistance movements, and it would never amount to anything, and the resistance would either crumble or surrender to the massive New Republic military, because Bail and later Mothma's democratic policies would prove most effective and too strong for even corrupt senators to break. General Kalani would eventually retire from service and would join Spectre Unit and become good friends with AP5. Him and Rex 2 would also become good friends too, just not as good as his friendship with AP5. The two droid minds really did think alike. The galaxy would be a better place, all thanks to General Kalani joining the Rebel Alliance. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story! Whew! I have been working on this story for quite a while. And now, as I did promise in my last video and my countless posts, an explanation as to why I haven't posted in a while. First of all, I would just like to say how truly sorry I am. Like, I am so sorry I took so long, guys. Oh gosh, how do I put this? So I didn't stop writing scripts. I had actually been writing quite a lot of Star Wars What If scripts because I either didn't really know how to finish them, or I got stuck on them, or I did some research for them, but I couldn't keep researching some of them. For example, I've got a Star Wars What If video that involves the Freemakers, but unfortunately I can't really go very far into that one because for some reason the show isn't on Disney Plus anymore, and I haven't been able to find any information as to why that's the case. I've also just had a lot going on, so that's why I've also been, because I've been very busy as well. I've had a lot of things going on, so unfortunately I haven't had as much time to do them. And plus the editing, especially for this one, did take a while. And also, as for the Darth Bane video, I'm going to hold that one back. I'm going to hold that one off for a little bit because I've written a script for him, but I don't feel like I truly understand Darth Bane or another certain character who's actually a part of that What If, but I won't say who. All I'll say is, Legends fans might be a little bit excited. That's all I'll say. That's all you're getting from me. But I will try and be a bit more consistent now because I actually have, in a crazy turn of events, managed to finish a whole lot of Star Wars What If scripts. So I'll just be recording them and editing them. And I actually will have at least a couple of months off, a couple of months free to just really work on these stories. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. You guys are awesome. And I'll see you guys next time on the Alternate Star Wars Galaxy.